Hello class, and welcome to our presentation, Introduction to Religious Ethics and Sexuality. So in this presentation, we're going to do a brief overview, and then we will talk about secular reflections on sexuality, and then we shall review some questions for consideration in this unit. So in this unit, we will be introduced to religious attitudes on sexual ethics. And our study will focus upon the traditions of Judaism, Christianity, Islam, and Buddhism. Now, because attitudes on sex vary widely within each of these traditions, we will focus primarily upon teachings found in sacred texts, because if we were to study all the different kind of religious expressions within our traditions, well, we could spend a whole course talking about that. So we're going to limit our study to primarily the foundational sacred texts. Now, as you may recall from the beginning of this course, I mentioned that we are going to bring our religious traditions into dialogue with what we might call like secular philosophical perspectives. So before we continue with our examination of religious attitudes on sex, let's first take a look at some of these secular philosophical attitudes on this issue. So of course we always have to begin with Plato, because Plato is considered to be like the father, like kind of like the true father of philosophy. So let's begin with him. So in the Republic, Plato argued that sexual desire belonged to the appetites, a base drive associated with human animal nature. Thus, sexual relationships were deemed inferior to rational relationships between philosophers. Indeed, it is from Plato that we get the term platonic relationship, or like a non-sexual, like cerebral relationship between two people. And for Plato, a truly enlightened life was a celibate life of contemplation. Now let's move on to Plato's pupil Aristotle. So in his Nicomachean Ethics, Aristotle viewed sex as a natural drive for the primary purpose of reproduction. So whereas Plato also regarded it as a natural drive, but kind of, again, a baser drive. But for Aristotle, being kind of like a proto-scientist, he believes, no, it's a natural thing, like it's okay. But again, it's done primarily for the purpose of reproduction. And Aristotle argued that a proper sexual relationship for human beings was monogamy. So he believed that monogamy was consistent with his ethic of the life of moderation. Hence resulting in kind of like a healthy life as designated as for us by nature. Now jumping to the 20th century, I want to talk a little bit about the philosopher Michel Foucault. So in his book, History of Sex, 20th century French philosopher Michel Foucault argued that people living in modernity needed to rethink and reevaluate the nature and meaning of human sexuality, and that such a reevaluation would lead to a liberation of sexual expressions once deemed immoral. So for Foucault, the Judeo-Christian and the Greek philosophical traditions of Plato and Aristotle defined sexual ethics in the West, which resulted in the repression of sexual practices deemed profane. So for Foucault, our attitudes on sex here in the West derive from the Jewish and Christian traditions, as well as the attitudes of Greek philosophers, and that their teachings have resulted in our kind of repressing our sexual desire, deeming such desires to be profane. Now, such a sexual ethic resulted in Western insecurities towards sexual drives and desires, insecurities which for Foucault are gradually being shed by Western society. And for Foucault, this is a good thing. So with Foucault's kind of perspective in mind, let's kind of review some questions that I would like for us to consider as we approach the material in this unit. So as we analyze our religious traditions, some questions to consider are as follows. Do religious teachings on sexual ethics heighten insecurities with respect to sexual desire? So in other words, is Foucault right? Do we feel kind of ashamed of our sexual drives? Do we consider them profane and therefore something to not celebrate? 2, in an age of sexual liberation where human sexuality is being reevaluated, is there a place for religious teachings on sexuality? Or are such teachings outdated? Or do religious values still play a meaningful role in 21st century sexual ethics? And lastly, as we study our traditions, do you notice any similarities between them? That is, are there major motifs that seem to cross over from tradition to tradition? So again, just 3 questions for us to think about, as we approach our material.